Hello class, today we're going to start a new unit, Unit 10, Chapter 18, Part A, the Cardiovascular System.
If you were to ask someone to name a piece of equipment used by a doctor or nurse, one of the most common answers would likely be a stethoscope. Doctors and nurses use a stethoscope to listen to a patient's heart in nearly every visit. The sound a heart makes when it beats conveys critical information on the patient's heart health. In this chapter, you'll learn about the anatomy and physiology of the heart, including what to listen for in patients' heart sounds. As a healthcare professional, it's critical that you understand heart physiology so that you can locate and identify abnormal heart sounds. Auscultating or listening to the heart with a stethoscope should reveal two sounds during each heartbeat. These sounds are often described as lub-dub and are associated with the heart valves closing. The basic rhythm of the heart sound is lub-dub, pause, lub-dub, and so on, with the pause indicating the period when the heart is relaxing. Understanding the rhythm of the heart will allow you to detect any abnormal heart sounds, which may indicate heart disease. For example, heart murmurs occur when blood backflows or regurgitates through a partially open valve after the valve has closed. In such a case, you will hear a swishing sound when you listen to the heart. By having a thorough understanding of the anatomy and physiology of the heart, you will be able to listen for and identify any abnormal heart sounds so that your patient can receive necessary treatment.
18.1, Heart Anatomy. So unlike most other muscles, the heart never rests. This extraordinary organ beats approximately 100,000 times each day, pumping roughly 8,000 liters of blood. The pulmonary and systemic circuits. The heart is a transport system consisting of two side-by-side pumps. The right side of the heart receives oxygen-poor blood from tissue, so it receives deoxygenated blood and pumps the blood to the lungs to oxygenate it, to get rid of the CO2, pick up oxygen via the pulmonary circuit. And then the left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, and it pumps the blood to the body tissues via the systemic circuit. Despite its impressive workload, the heart is a small organ, roughly the size of a clenched fist. The heart contains 4 muscular chambers, 2 associated with each circuit. So the receiving chambers of the heart are the right atrium that receives blood returning from the systemic circuit, and the left atrium that receives blood that's returning from the pulmonary circuit. And the pumping chambers of the heart are the right ventricles, the right ventricle which pumps blood through the pulmonary circuit, and the left ventricle that pumps blood through the systemic circuit. 18.1, the systemic and pulmonary circuits. So in red, it's oxygen-rich, CO2-poor blood, whereas in blue, it's oxygen-poor, CO2-rich blood. So we can see that the right side of the heart is receiving deoxygenated blood or oxygen-poor, CO2-rich blood from systemic circulation. And so it goes into the right atrium, and then from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and then right ventricle, it ends up in the pulmonary arteries that will bring this CO2-rich blood to the pulmonary circuit. And then that's where gas exchange occurs, as we learned, right, at the alveoli. And then the oxygen-rich blood is going to come back through the pulmonary veins. It's going to go into the left atrium, the left ventricle, and then through the aorta and the branches of the aorta to the systemic circulation, to the systemic circuit. Of size, location, and orientation of the heart. So we said it's approximately the size of a fist. It weighs less than a pound, and it's located in the mediastinum between the second rib and the 5th intercostal space on the superior surface of the diaphragm, 2/3 of the heart to the left of the midsternal line, and it's anterior to the vertebral column but posterior to the sternum. Figure 18.2a shows the location of the heart in the mediastinum. So remember, the mediastinum is the region between the two pleural cavities. It also contains the thymus, esophagus, and trachea. So this figure is a sectional view that illustrates the position of the heart relative to other structures in the mediastinum. This figure 18.2b is a cross-section through the mediastinum, showing you the positioning of the heart, the left lung, and through the body of the eighth thoracic vertebra. The great veins and arteries are connected to the superior end of the heart at the attached base. So that's the base is the posterior surface and leads toward the right shoulder. The apex of the heart points toward the left hip. Apical impulse palpated between the 5th and 6th ribs, just below the left nipple. This figure shows the location of the apical impulse. The lining of the pericardial cavity is called the pericardium, which is a double-walled sac that surrounds the heart, made up of two layers: a superficial fibrous pericardium that functions to protect, anchor the heart to the surrounding structures, and prevent overfilling, and a deep two-layered serous pericardium that consists of a parietal layer that lines the internal surface of the fibrous pericardium, visceral layer or epicardium on the external surface of the heart, and the two layers are separated by a fluid-filled pericardial cavity that decreases friction. 18.3, the layers of the pericardium and of the heart. So if we start, if you look on the left, the pericardium and myocardium is basically the heart muscle because it's a cardiac muscle, as we learned. So we have from top to bottom the fibrous pericardium, the parietal layer of serous pericardium, then there's the pericardial cavity, then there's the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, also known as epicardium, and then we have the myocardium, and then the endocardium, and then the heart chamber. So in that case, it would be the left atrium. Clinical homeostatic imbalance, 18.1, pericarditis. Pathogens can infect the pericardium, producing the condition pericarditis, which is inflammation of the pericardium. So the inflamed pericardial surfaces rub against one another, producing a distinctive scratching sound called pericardial friction rub, or that creaking sound that can be heard with a stethoscope. The pericardial irritation and inflammation also commonly result in an increased production of pericardial fluid. Fluid then collects in the pericardial cavity, restricting the movement of the heart. This condition is called cardiac tamponade. That can also be caused by traumatic injuries, such as a gunshot wound, that produce bleeding into the pericardial cavity. And the treatment is fluid is drawn out of the cavity, usually with a syringe. Of the heart wall. So a section through the wall of the heart reveals three distinct layers: an outer epicardium, a middle myocardium, and an inner endocardium. So epicardium is a visceral layer of serous pericardium that covers the outer surface of the heart. The myocardium is it's a muscular wall. It's the muscular wall of the heart, forms both the atria and the ventricles. It consists of circular or spiral bundles of contractile cardiac muscle cells. And then So the cardiac skeleton is a crisscrossing, interlacing layer of connective tissue. It anchors the cardiac muscle fibers, supports the great vessels and valves, and limits the spread of action potentials to specific paths. Figure 18.4 shows the circular and spiral arrangement of cardiac muscle bundles in the myocardium of the heart. So the inner surface of the heart, including those of the heart valves, are covered by endocardium and is continuous with the endothelial lining of blood vessels, which is a simple squamous epithelium, so it lines the heart chambers and covers the cardiac skeleton of valves. Again, figure 18.3, you can see the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium, which make up the heart wall. Chambers and associated great vessels. The heart contains 4 muscular chambers, 2 superior atria and 2 inferior ventricles. Interatrial septum separates the atria. The fossa ovalis is a remnant of the foramen ovale of the fetal heart, whereas the interventricular septum separates the ventricles. 18.5e, the gross anatomy of the heart. So if you find in bold letters the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. You can also see the interventricular septum that separates the 2 ventricles, and the fossa ovalis, which is found in between the 2 atrias. Surface features: the coronary sulcus, also the atrioventricular grooves, encircles the junction of the atria and the ventricles. The anterior interventricular sulcus is the anterior position of the interventricular septum, and the posterior interventricular sulcus, which is found in the back of the heart, it's a landmark on the posterior inferior surface. Figure 18.5b, so gross anatomy of the heart, we're looking at the anterior view. On the right, you can see the right coronary artery, which is found in the coronary sulcus. And on the left, if you find the left coronary artery, which is found in the coronary sulcus, also, if you go towards the apex of the heart, you can see the anterior interventricular artery in the anterior interventricular sulcus. Figure 18.5d, the posterior view of the heart. Now we can see the posterior interventricular artery, which is found in the posterior interventricular sulcus. Okay, so let's look at the chambers and associated great vessels. So the atria are the receiving chambers. They're small, thin-walled chambers that contribute little to the propulsion of blood. Auricles are the appendages that increase atrial volume. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body. It means that the blood is rich in CO2. The anterior portion is smooth-walled. The posterior portion contains ridges formed by pectinate muscles. Posterior and anterior regions are separated by the crista terminalis. 3 veins empty into the right atrium: the superior vena cava that returns blood from the body regions above the diaphragm, the inferior vena cava that returns blood from body regions below the diaphragm, and the coronary sinus that returns blood from the coronary veins of the heart. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, and the pectinate muscles are found only in the auricles. 4 pulmonary veins return blood from the lungs. Figure 18.5e, frontal section of the heart. You can find the right atrium and left atrium. The right atrium, you can see the pectinate muscles. You can also see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. On the left, you can see again the left atrium. The ventricles are the discharging chambers that make up most of the volume of the heart. The right ventricle is most of the anterior surface. The left ventricle is located in the posterior inferior surface. Trabeculae carneae are irregular ridges of muscle on the ventricular walls, whereas the papillary muscles project into the ventricular cavity, and they anchor the chordae tendineae that are attached to the heart valves. The ventricles have thicker walls than the atria. It's the actual pump of the heart. And the right ventricle, pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk, and then the left ventricle pumps the blood into the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. So again, this frontal section of the heart, you can see the right ventricle. Notice the chordae tendineae, which are fibers basically that originate from the papillary muscles. Then we can see the trabeculae carneae. In the left ventricle, you can see the papillary muscle, and you can see that's okay. This figure 18.5c, gross anatomy of the heart, you can see the pectinate muscles, which are on the inner surface of the auricle, these prominent muscular ridges. Also, you can see the fossa ovalis, which is basically what's left of the foramen ovale. So during embryonic development, the foramen ovale connects the two atria and permits blood flow from the right atrium to the left atrium while the lungs are developing before birth. But then at birth, the foramen ovale closes and the opening will be permanently sealed off within 3 months of delivery. So the fossa ovalis is a small shallow depression that persists at the site in the adult heart. Figure 18.5f, we can see on the right side the chordae tendineae that arise from the papillary muscle. On the left side, you can see the same thing, the papillary muscle and the chordae tendineae. And then you can see the pulmonary trunk as well, that is coming from the right atrium. Figure 18.5a, find the right atrium, the right ventricle, the auricle of left atrium. Then you can see the anterior interventricular artery, which is found in the anterior interventricular sulcus. Then the left ventricle, the apex of the heart. Find the pulmonary trunk and the aortic arch. Section 18.2, heart valves. So the valves ensure a unidirectional blood flow through the heart. They open and close in response to pressure changes. The two major types of valves are called the atrioventricular valves, located between the atria and the ventricles, and the semilunar valves that are located between the ventricles and the major arteries. Valves are found between the major veins and atria, which is not a problem because inertia of incoming blood prevents backflow, and the heart contractions compress the venous openings. 18.6a and b, the heart valves. So you can see the the mitral or left atrioventricular valve, the tricuspid or right atrioventricular valve, the aortic valve, and the pulmonary valve. The two atrioventricular valves prevent the backflow into the atria when the ventricles contract. The tricuspid valve is the right atrioventricular valve, is made up of three cusps and lies between the right atria and ventricle. The mitral valve, which is the left atrioventricular valve, or it's a bicuspid valve made up of two cusps and lies between the left atria and left atrium and ventricle. Chordae tendineae anchor the cusps of the atrioventricular valves to the papillary muscles that function to hold the valve flaps in a closed position and prevent the flaps from everting back into the atria. In figure 18.6c and D, you can see the heart valves. In C, you can see the chordae tendineae that are attached to the tricuspid valve flap, and they are being held by the papillary muscle. Here you can see in the there's the right atrium, and then you can see the tricuspid valve and the chordae tendineae, and then the mitral valve on the left side, and notice the papillary muscles. Figure 18.7a, the function of the atrioventricular valves. So blood returning to the heart fills the atria, pressing against the atrioventricular valves. The increased pressure forces the atrioventricular valves to open. As the ventricles fill, the AV valve flaps hang limply into the ventricles. The atria contract, forcing additional blood into the ventricles. And this is, so in A, the AV valves are open and the atrial pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure. Then the ventricles contract, forcing blood against the AV valve cusps. The AV valves close, papillary muscles contract, and chordae tendineae tighten, preventing the valve flaps from everting into the atria. So here in this figure, figure B, the AV valves are closed and the atrial pressure is less than the ventricular pressure.
Heart valves open and close due to pressure in the blood in the surrounding chambers and not because of muscle contraction. The atrioventricular valves open when the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles. This opens the AV valves so that blood can flow from the atria into the ventricles. When the ventricles begin to contract, then the pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the atria, and under these conditions the AV valves shut. AV valves open when the pressure in the atria is greater than in the ventricles, and this occurs in the first half of the cardiac cycle, and they are closed when the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the pressure in the atria, and this occurs in the second half of the cardiac cycle.
So the semilunar or SL valves, so the pulmonary and aortic valves prevent the backflow of blood from the pulmonary trunk and aorta into the right and left ventricles, respectively. So they open and close in response to pressure changes. Each valve consists of three cusps that roughly resemble half moon. Specifically, the pulmonary semilunar valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, whereas the aortic semilunar valve is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. So unlike the AV valves, the semilunar valves do not require muscular braces because the atrial walls do not contract and the relative positions of the cusps are stable. So when the semilunar valves close, the three symmetrical cusps support one another like the legs of a tripod. Figure 18.8a, the function of the semilunar valves. So in A, the semilunar valves are open. So as the ventricles contract and the intraventricular pressure rises, blood is pushed up against the semilunar valves, forcing them open. Figure B, the semilunar valves are closed. So as the ventricles relax and the intraventricular pressure falls, blood flows back from the arteries, filling the cusps of the semilunar valves and forcing them to close.
The heart's semilunar valves also open and close due to pressure and not because of muscle contractions. When the pressure in the ventricles is greater than in the pressure in the vessels, this would be the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, under these conditions the semilunar valves open and blood can be expelled from the heart. When, however, the pressure in the vessels is greater than the pressure in the ventricles, these semilunar valves close. So the semilunar valves are open in the second half of the cardiac cycle when the ventricles are contracting, because the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the pressure in the vessels. However, in the first half of the cardiac cycle, the semilunar valves are closed because the pressure in the vessels is greater than the pressure in the ventricles.
Homeostatic imbalance 18.2. There are two conditions that severely weaken the heart. One of them is incompetent valve, where the blood backflows, so the heart repumps the same blood over and over. And the other is valvular stenosis, where the stiff flaps that constrict, there are stiff flaps that constrict the opening, and the heart needs to exert more force to pump blood. The defective valve can be replaced with mechanical, animal, or cadaver valve. A person can be born with valve disease, so it could be congenital, or develop a problem later in life, so it's acquired. And sometimes the cause of valve disease may be unknown. Section 18.3, the pathway of blood through the heart. So let's start from the right side of the heart. So deoxygenated blood comes from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus into the right atrium. Then from the right atrium into the right ventricle, there's the tricuspid valve. And then from the right ventricle to the pulmonary tract, there's the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then from the pulmonary trunk, the deoxygenated blood is pumped through the pulmonary arteries that bring this blood to the lungs for oxygenation. On the left side of the heart, so from the lungs, oxygenated blood comes back via the 4 pulmonary veins into the left atrium, through the mitral valve, into the left ventricle. There's the aortic semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta, and then the aorta is going to bring it to systemic circulation. So figure 18.1, the heart is a double pump, each side supplying its own circuit. So again, in blue is oxygen poor blood, and in red is oxygen rich blood. So here we can see the superior and inferior vena cavas and the coronary sinus bring in the blood into the right atrium, and then through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then from the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, and then the pulmonary trunk is going to pump it through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Oxygen poor blood is carried in 2 pulmonary arteries to the lungs, that's called the pulmonary circuit, to be oxygenated. So oxygenation occurs, and then oxygen rich blood returns to the heart via the 4 pulmonary veins. Here now, from the 4 pulmonary veins, if you look on the right bottom, into the left atrium, so this is oxygenated blood from the lungs, right? Through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle is going to pump it to the aorta via the aortic semilunar valve, and the aorta is going to deliver this oxygen-rich blood to the body tissues, and this is systemic circuit. and then oxygen poor blood is going to return from the body tissues back to the heart. This figure here shows combines the two, shows how the heart is a double pump and each side supplying its own circuit. Section 18.3, pathway of blood through the heart. So equal volumes of blood are pumped to the pulmonary and systemic circuits. The pulmonary circuit is short, low pressure circulation, whereas the systemic circuit is long, high friction circulation. The anatomy of ventricles reflects these differences. The left ventricle walls are 3 times thicker than the right, and so it pumps with a greater pressure. Anatomical differences between the right and left ventricles. So this is figure 18.9. So the right ventricle has a thinner wall than the left ventricle. It has a crescent shape and wraps around the left ventricle. The left ventricle has a thicker wall than the right ventricle and a round shape. The lungs are close to the heart and the pulmonary blood vessels are relatively short and wide. Thus, the right ventricle normally does not need to push very hard to propel the blood through the pulmonary circuit. And that's why the walls are relatively thinner. Instead, this would not be suitable for the left ventricle because it needs 6 to 7 times as much force exerted to push the blood around the systemic circuit as around the pulmonary circuit. So the left ventricle has an extremely thick muscular wall and is round, as you can see in the cross section. So when the left ventricle contracts, the distance between the base and the apex decreases, and 2, the diameter of the ventricular chamber decreases. Circulation. So it's basically the functional blood supply to the heart muscle itself. It's the shortest circulation in the body, and it's delivered when the heart is relaxed. The left ventricle receives most of the coronary blood supply. Coronary arteries. So both the left and right coronary arteries arise from the base of the aorta and supply arterial blood to the heart. Both encircle the heart in a coronary sulcus. Branching of the coronary arteries varies among individuals. Arteries contain many anastomoses or junctions that provide additional routes for blood delivery and cannot compensate for coronary artery occlusion. The heart receives 1/20th of the body's blood supply. The left coronary artery supplies the interventricular septum, anterior ventricular walls, the left atrium, and posterior wall of the left ventricle, and it has 2 branches, the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. The right coronary artery supplies the right atrium and most of the right ventricle and has 2 branches, the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. Under 18.10a, coronary circulation, you can see the left coronary artery, the circumflex artery, the anterior interventricular artery, and then on the right, there's the right coronary artery and the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. And you can also see the anastomosis, which is the junction of the vessels. Coronary veins collect blood from the capillary beds. The coronary sinus empties into the right atrium formed by merging cardiac veins. The great cardiac vein of the anterior interventricular sulcus, the middle cardiac vein in the posterior interventricular sulcus, and the small cardiac vein from the inferior margin. Several anterior cardiac veins empty directly into the right atrium anteriorly. Figure 18.10b, coronary circulation. You can see the great cardiac vein. You can see the coronary sinus and the anterior cardiac veins and then the small cardiac vein and the middle cardiac vein. 18.5D, on the left you can see the great cardiac vein, and on the right you can see the right coronary artery, again in the coronary sulcus, the posterior interventricular artery in the posterior interventricular sulcus, and the middle cardiac vein.
Your heart is an extraordinary machine. During your lifetime, your heart's muscular walls pump blood into blood vessels branching throughout your body. Your heart has 4 chambers. 2 upper chambers, called the left and right atria, and 2 lower chambers, called the left and right ventricles, contract in a steady rhythm known as your heartbeat. During a normal heartbeat, blood from your tissues and lungs flows into your atria, then into your ventricles. Walls inside your heart, called the interatrial and interventricular septa, help keep the blood on left and right sides from mixing. Two valves sit like doors between your atria and ventricles to prevent blood from flowing backward into your atria. The tricuspid valve opens into your right ventricle, and the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve, opens into your left ventricle. Strong, thin tissues, called chordae tendineae, hold your valves in place during the forceful contractions of your ventricles. Blood leaving the ventricles passes through another set of valves, the pulmonary valve between your right ventricle and pulmonary trunk, and the aortic valve connecting your left ventricle and aorta. In order to pump blood more efficiently, your heart muscle, called myocardium, is arranged in a unique pattern. 3 layers of myocardium wrap around the lower part of your heart. They twist and tighten in different directions to push blood through your heart. When special cells, called pacemaker cells, generate electrical signals inside your heart, the heart muscle cells, called myocytes, contract as a group. Your heart is divided into left and right halves, which work together like a dual pump. On the right side of your heart, deoxygenated blood from your body's tissues flows through large veins called the superior and inferior vena cava into your right atrium. Next, the blood moves into your right ventricle, which contracts and sends blood out of your heart to your lungs to gather oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. On the left side of your heart, oxygen-rich blood from your lungs flows through your pulmonary veins into your left atrium. The blood then moves into your left ventricle, which contracts and sends blood out of your heart through the aorta to feed your cells and tissues. The first branches off your aorta are the coronary arteries, which supply your heart muscle with oxygen and nutrients. At the top of your aorta, arteries branch off to carry blood to your head and arms. Arteries branching from the middle and lower parts of your aorta supply blood to the rest of your body. Your heart beats an average of 60 to 100 beats per minute. In that 1 minute, your heart pumps about 5 quarts of blood through your arteries, delivering a steady stream of oxygen and nutrients all over your body.
Homeostatic imbalance 18.3. Angina pectoris is the medical term for chest pain or discomfort due to coronary heart disease. It occurs when the heart muscle doesn't get as much blood as it needs. This usually happens because one or more of the heart's arteries is narrowed or blocked, also called as ischemia. Myocardial infarction is a heart attack. It's due to a prolonged coronary blockage, and areas of cell death are repaired with non-contractile scar tissue. Section 18.4, cardiac muscle fibers. Microscopic anatomy of the heart. So it consists of cardiac muscle cells, which are striated, short, branched, fat, and interconnected. There is one central nucleus, at most 2 nuclei. And also, cardiac muscle contains numerous large mitochondria, which make up 25 to 35% of the cell volume that afford resistance to fatigue. The rest of the volume is composed of sarcomeres, which are, with the Z discs, A bands, and I bands, that are all present, similar to skeletal muscle. I really don't expect you to know this because we haven't covered muscles. The T tubules are wider but less numerous. They enter the cell only once at Z discs, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum is simpler than in skeletal muscle. There are no triads. I will not ask questions about sarcomeres on the test because I know we haven't covered this section. Remember in the lab we saw the intercalated discs of cardiac muscle. These are connecting junctions between cardiac cells that contain desmosomes that hold cells together and prevent cells from separating during contraction, and gap junctions that allow ions to pass from cell to cell, electrically couple adjacent cells. It allows the heart to be a functional syncytium, which is a single coordinated unit. Intercellular space between the cells has connective tissue matrix called the endomysium, and it contains numerous capillaries, and it connects the cardiac muscle to cardiac skeleton, giving cells something to pull against. Figure 18.11a, microscopic anatomy of the cardiac muscle. So in A, we can recognize cardiac muscle cell with the intercalated discs, and we can see in the middle figure the gap junctions that allow ions to go through, and the desmosomes that keep the myocytes from pulling apart during contractions.
Of the 3 types of muscle, cardiac muscle is unique in the intercalated discs which join neighboring cardiac muscle fibers. At these discs, the conical ends of the cells interlock, and there are 2 specialized junctions. There are desmosomes for strength and gap junctions which allow ions to pass from cell to cell and allow action potentials to travel between cells. At a desmosome, molecules of cadherin from each of the 2 cardiac muscle cells link, and these molecules of cadherin are then attached to proteins known as catenins in plaques, which then link to the intermediate filaments of the cytoskeleton. Thus, when one cardiac muscle cell contracts, it is physically joined to the cytoskeleton of neighboring cells, and this allows the junctions to withstand the tension of their contraction. Because gap junctions allow ions to pass directly between cells, there is no synaptic delays, and thus the muscle fibers of a chamber can contract as a unit. Although the cardiac muscle cells are separate from each other and distinct cells, they are not a fused mass of cells known as a syncytium. They nevertheless act as a functional syncytium because they are physically, chemically, and electrically joined because of these desmosomes and gap junctions.
Figure 18.11b, this is the again, microscopic anatomy of the cardiac muscle. So here we can see that it has lots of mitochondria, usually 1 nucleus. The membrane around the cardiac muscle cell is called the sarcolemma, and then it's got the bands there, the I bands and A bands, and the components of the sarcomere, which we're really not going to go into detail. Then there's the sarcoplasmic reticulum and T tubules. That's where the nerve impulse travels down the T tubule for contraction of the cardiac muscle. How does the physiology of skeletal and cardiac muscle differ? So similarities with skeletal muscle contraction is preceded by depolarizing action potential. So that's the nerve impulse. Depolarization wave travels down the T tubules that causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. And then there's a excitation contraction coupling that occurs where the calcium binds to troponin, causing the filaments to slide. Differences between cardiac and skeletal muscle. Some cardiac muscle cells are self-excitable. There are two kinds of myocytes, contractile cells that are responsible for contraction, and pacemaker cells, which are non-contractile cells that spontaneously depolarize. They initiate depolarization of the entire heart and do not need nervous system stimulation, in contrast to the skeletal muscle fibers. It contracts as a unit. All the cardiomyocytes contract as a unit, which is a functional syncytium. It's or none contract, so either all or none. Contraction of all cardiac myocytes ensures effective pumping action. Skeletal muscles, on the other hand, contract independently. The influx of calcium from extracellular fluid triggers calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So depolarization opens the slow calcium channels in the sarcolemma, allowing calcium to enter the cell. Extracellular calcium then causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its intracellular calcium. Skeletal muscles do not use extracellular calcium. The calcium is only found, the calcium that is used in skeletal muscle is found within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Another difference is that tetanic contractions cannot occur in cardiac muscles. Cardiac muscle fibers have longer absolute refractory period than skeletal muscle fibers. The absolute refractory period is almost as long as contraction itself, which this prevents tetanic contractions that are seen in skeletal muscle. And this allows the heart to relax and fill as needed to be an efficient pump. Also, the heart relies almost exclusively on aerobic respiration. Cardiac muscle has more mitochondria than skeletal muscle, so it has greater dependence on oxygen. In fact, it cannot function without oxygen. Skeletal muscle can go through fermentation when oxygen is not present. Both types of tissues can use other fuel sources. Cardiac is more adaptable to other fuels, including lactic acid, but must have oxygen. Table 18.1, key differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle. So in terms of structure, skeletal muscle is striated, long, cylindrical, and multinucleate, whereas cardiac muscle is also striated, but it's short, branched, and it has 1 or 2 nuclei per cell. Are there gap junctions between the cells in skeletal muscle? No, whereas they are present in cardiac muscle. In terms of contracting as a unit, skeletal muscle doesn't. Motor units must be stimulated individually, whereas cardiac muscle does contract as a unit because of the presence of gap junctions that create a functional syncytium. T-tubules are abundant in skeletal muscle, whereas there are fewer and wider in cardiac muscle. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is elaborate in skeletal muscle. It has also terminal cisterns, whereas it's less elaborate in cardiac muscle. There are no terminal cisterns. The source of calcium for contraction is the sarcoplasmic reticulum only in skeletal muscle, whereas in cardiac muscle, it's the sarcoplasmic reticulum and extracellular fluid. In both skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, calcium binds to troponin. There are no pacemaker cells present in skeletal muscle where they are present in cardiac muscle. Tetanus is possible in skeletal muscle, whereas it's not possible in cardiac muscle. And in terms of the supply of ATP, skeletal muscle can use both aerobic and anaerobic pathways to generate ATP. It has fewer mitochondria, whereas cardiac muscle relies exclusively on aerobic pathways, and as a result